heat and DSM-5. We come back to DSM-5. Last time we did a series, psychoanalysis and DSM-5, in which we took a look at how out of all the chapters of DSM, about 18 chapters or 16 chapters, stand corrected, whatever the number be, but 16 to 18 chapters of DSM contain disorders where psychotherapy can play a significant role. We took up each of those chapters and using different schools of psychoanalysis, we arrived at pathogenesis and broad direction for therapy. In the passing, we also mentioned something about holistic healing. We come back to DSM-5 again with an expanded model of the mind, not only a model of the mind, it's a full system of psychotherapy called HEAT, Holistic Elemental Analysis and Therapy. What HEAT does is it combines or tries to combine different schools of psychotherapy, different schools of psychoanalysis, different schools of East and West, and also creates some new and novel concepts which widen and deepen our understanding of pathology and healing. In the first session of the series HEAT and DSM-5, we took a look at the general framework of how the HEAT framework is. We also took a look at how a HEAT framework is wider, deeper, more comprehensive, more holistic than the classical frameworks we use in psychoanalysis or Western psychotherapy in general. We said in the first session of the series that we will now apply HEAT to different chapters of DSM-5 and see how a traditional classical psychoanalytic approach to DSM-5, either from vantage point of a single psychoanalysis school or multiple schools of psychoanalysis, or an eclectic approach using different forms of therapy, how all of that is different from the HEAT approach. So let us apply HEAT to the chapter on schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, the second chapter of part 2 of DSM. The first chapter is on neurodevelopmental disorders, where the biological component is a very strong component. So we start from the second chapter of part 2 of DSM-5, schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. As we saw in the last session of general framework, the HEAT framework of approaching healing is a 5-step framework. Phase 1 is case history taking. Phase 2 is psychological testing. Phase 3 is pathogenesis. Phase 4 is healing. And phase 5 is living. You can put in consolidation phase also. So let us start with the phase 1 and see how a HEAT approach would be different from a classical approach that we take. Let us start with case history. Case history taking in the heat approach is more comprehensive than in the classical approach. In the classical approach, what we take is the personal particulars, the chief complaint, secondary complaints, the history of the sickness, early childhood, later childhood, young age, what has worked in countering the sickness, what has not worked. We take all this data and we end up with the mental status examination. In heat approach, we do all of that, but additionally, we add these 5 elements to the classical case history report. First is, so we do all that we do otherwise in our classical approach of psychiatry or psychoanalysis or eclectic combo approach. So we take the normal case history, but we add to it these 5 elements. So it will be a case history form will expand by these 5 items added to the case history form. First is the patient's story of suffering. How does the patient describe his story of suffering? Because he has in mind his own ideas about pathogenesis, about healing, about what works, what does not work, why he is suffering in life. Is there a past life connection? Is there a karmic connection? Right or wrong, those things apart, it is necessary to know the patient's version of his suffering, which includes his ideas on the causation of suffering, often even a justification of suffering, and the road to healing. The story of symptoms is very necessary. And the story of symptoms has to be comprehensive to include the causation as well as the healing approach according to the patient. Second element is of the patient's involvement in the mystical aspect of life, if any. Does the patient know anything about energy healing, about mystical practices? Is he involved in some school? If yes, and if we give adequate respect and provide safety, the patient tells us a much elaborate story of his life, his beliefs, his suffering. And of course, all of this is data for further psychoanalytic thinking or further psychotherapeutic thinking. The third is, does the patient believe in reincarnation, karma, the goal of life, almost a destiny of life? Fourth is the dream collection. In the third, does the patient believe that the symptoms have anything to do with his past lives or karma? Fourth is the dream collection. Are there dreams which are recurring? Are there dreams the patient recollects? If night dreams are not recollected, can the patient share some of the daydreams, day fantasies? Fifth is the first observation report. This is something to be written by the healer, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, or whoever is the healer. The first observation report is almost like the first information report, but this is different. The first observation report is when you meet the person for the first time. What is your impression about the person? What do you think about the person? And what do you feel in his presence? Do you feel relaxed? Do you get a precox feeling? Do you feel irritated? Do you feel angry? Do you feel seduced? Do you feel sleepy? What do you feel? Or do you feel normal like meeting any other healthy person? The first observation report is very important because it is before the data has actually biased your opinions. So the raw response, the first response to the person is very important. Partly it will bring up the healer's unresolved material, but after some practice, it will largely be the material of the patient. The more the healer works on himself, the more he becomes a blank screen. This is how the first phase of heat is different from the classical approach. When we apply this approach to schizophrenia and psychosis, the story that we are likely to get is more likely to be a magical story, a psychotic story. It will be difficult to separate the fact from fiction. However, we follow the general model and we take this data with the caveat that unlike a neurotic person, where all of this is rooted in reality, in schizophrenia and psychosis, we might get a strange combination of fact and fiction. And in the first observation report, the precox feeling would appear. Phase 2, psychological testing. In psychological testing, like in case history, we go as per the classical method, but we add to it something from pranic healing, because pranic healing also provides a technique to test out certain elements which exist or don't exist. We give primary importance to our classical tests and secondary importance to pranic healing, but we use it for a confirmation, a secondary confirmation, and also for exploring certain elements which otherwise are confusing or non-conclusive. So we bring in this new element, just as in case history taking, we bring in these 5 new elements. Here we bring in this new element. And because we are in the holistic healing domain, if the healer wishes to explore if some mystical forces or beings are also involved in the psychosis, it can be explored. Not that that becomes a center point of the healing approach. We don't want to convert science into magic, but we want to use something which is between art and science, something which is a craft, but has certain good things to offer science. With scruple and vigilance, we make use of those craft disciplines. So we use Roja and pranic healing here. And pranic healing can be used to find out which bodies are impacted to what extent. which chakras are impacted to what extent, where is the blockage to the prana flow, is there any difficulty in the physical body. All the questions in yes or no, in essential sense, we can get from pranic healing. Of course, can it go wrong? Any test can go wrong. It depends on the healer. So, with the caveat that we are not in the world of absolutes, and everything has to be put to test of empirical experience and investigation. With that caveat, we go holistic. Phase 3 is pathogenesis. This is the crux of the whole thing, pathogenesis and healing. Because pathogenesis and healing of heat is very different from pathogenesis and healing of the classical approach that we find in psychoanalysis or Western psychotherapy in general. If we look at psychiatry, the causation usually is elaborated in terms of neurochemistry, biochemistry, or working of certain organs, especially the neurological apparatus. If we go into causation in psychoanalysis, usually it is elaborated from vantage point of one school of psychoanalysis, whatever one is practicing. If we go at slightly higher levels in psychoanalysis, we can get causation elaborated in terms of multiple schools of psychoanalysis. In heat, we take not only the wide multi-school approach of psychoanalysis, but we use schools outside of psychoanalysis in the West, as well as schools in the East, and whatever is the limit of our knowledge, as much we know, we use all of it to be put together to understand the causation of the event. But here we put into use a broader event causation structural framework, which is philosophical, because psychological event is also an event. So if we have a comprehensive framework of how any event can get caused, that generic framework can always be specified to a psychological event, because psychological event is one specific type of event. And therefore, the general event causation framework will always be applicable, suitably modified to this context. Then we look at, after looking at the general causation in a philosophical way, we come back more specific to the body, and here we practice the 5 concepts of the concept of 5 bodies. And then we look at the region or the organ which is impacted, if it is only a psychological symptom or there is also a conversion disorder, in which case organs also will be involved or may be involved. And then the general mechanism as we understand in general, not in biochemical or molecular or atomic terms, but in a general way as we can understand it. Then we come to the use of all the schools that we know and do a multi-school analysis, preferably involving schools from East and West both. And that helps us after deliberation to come at some explanation which may involve one school or more schools as to how the pathology would have developed. And once we realize, for example, if we come to conclude that the schizophrenia we are talking about looks to be based upon Freud's explanation. That seems to be a more credible explanation because the person has reported repressed homosexual fantasies. Based upon the case history, we'll get an idea whether the Freudian school is more applicable or the Kleinian school is more applicable or the Bionian approach is more applicable. And once we decide that a particular school seems to be more close to explaining the phenomena based upon the patient situation we have in front of us, then we know the phenomena also. So we may look at the Freudian Oedipal phenomena in schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, or we may, if the patient has said something about homosexuality, or if we feel that there is a homosexual dynamic at work, even unconsciously, then it is worthwhile to explore the Freudian school. If we see the split in operation, a very early primitive way of relating to part objects, then the Kleinian school may be a better explanation. If we see too much of envy and narcissistic rage, and we are looking at a cognitive thought disorder as one of the major features, then Bionian school may be more applicable. And whatever school we feel gives the best explanation, and whatever process the school describes is the best explanation, then we know the processes which are involved. Is it the paranoid schizoid split open? Is it the repressed homosexuality phenomena of Freud? Or is it the attack on linking of beyond? Or is it the disintegration of self of cohort? Whatever phenomena we choose, and we note down that based upon the as much knowledge that we have, these seem to be the phenomena, then we take up the analysis of that process. So if we are looking at Oedipal process, we go into deconstruction of the Oedipal process. If we look at the split process, we deconstruct the split process. If we look at attack on linking, we deconstruct the attack on linking, first in epistemological terms and then in affective terms. When we deconstruct in epistemological terms, first we look at the essential epistemological process, which we'll see in a moment, and then we look at epistemological elements, then affect life cycle, and then we get into elementals. The psychological elementals that I have created for this model. So first, let us look at the first element in pathogenesis, the general philosophical causation of any event, including the traumatic event. So if we apply it to schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, there are certain elements which we have to put. Can it be that the person wants a particular experience and therefore the person's unconscious has taken to psychosis? Is this a part of a larger journey of the universe? Regardless of what the answers are, the second we can rule out completely, because regardless of what the answer is, we can't do anything about it. Can it be the karma of others? No. Can it be the karma created by principle? Yes, but rare. Can it be the free will of others? No. Can it be chance? Unlikely. Can it be freedom and grace? Unlikely. So when we eliminate from the comprehensive model what seems unlikely or something that we cannot do anything about, we are left with certain elements which are useful. For example, can the person be suffering from it because this is the journey his soul has decided? Can it be the karma? Can it be the free will of the self? No, it will not be the free will. It can be free will under the influence of the unconscious. It cannot be a conscious free will. Can there be suprahuman forces and beings at work possible in the holistic framework? Can laws of nature be at work? Of course, this is the core explanation. This is 80% of the whole thing. Rest is 20%. So based upon the patient, we can go into specifics. Since we don't have a patient, we'll have to talk in general because I can't upload anything specific of any patient on the YouTube. So we'll have to talk in generality. But if you apply it, get into any issue, we can discuss it. So let us look at applying this. First part, can it be this possible? Of course, 80% of explanation is this laws of nature. But for the rest of it, can this be a contributor? Difficult to make out unless we go deep into therapy. One way to find out the proportionate contribution is by using some methods of pranic healing. Later, as we go into therapy, of course, we can figure out it much better. So we have a provisional judgment in this area, and then we refine that judgment as we go into therapy. However, to start with in the provisional part, we can use pranic healing. And if anything comes intense, let us say the karma of the self becomes intense, then there are ways of addressing this element. If this element is to be addressed, there are ways of addressing this element. We did not know everything. We can send it to refer the person to somebody who is adept in this area or this area. But whatever is the element, it has to be addressed with the help of some person good in that area. Take a look at the comprehensive 5-body and 2-element system. Whatever is useful, take it there. Whatever is not useful, remove it. Let us say there is an attack on linking and the femininity, masculinity is not so much of an issue, then remove this part. Say we are dealing with a cognitive thought disorder. And if this energy system seems, it will be useful actually. But let's say we are looking at cognitive thought disorder, we don't see anything predominantly physical. Remove this part. This will be by and large applicable to him. Then pick and choose has to be done. The core is wherever the problem is, we have schools which can address it, and based upon the person, a package of healing can be created. To address this, something can be taken from here. To address this, something can be taken from here. And that will create a holistic healing package. Third is the school of which school. Let's say we have a schizophrenic case where homosexuality is at work, we use the Freudian school. Another case where split is open, we use the Kleinian school. Another case where the self disintegrates, we use the Coercion school. Another case where there is a cognitive thought disorder, attack on linking, we use the Bionian school. We can also use from the East the Yoga Psychology school, Tantra school, Sherbindo school, or HEAT to add to this or refine, or when this cannot explain, or to get a recast of here in these terms, more elemental terms. So let us say we look at a Freudian person, a person with schizophrenia, say there is delusion of persecution, and there is a latent homosexual dynamic at work. So we use the Freudian school. And when we look at the Tantra psychology, we see the same thing recast in more elemental terms, that this is a problem of the Swadhisthana, the sex chakra. So the sex chakra cleaning and healing becomes necessary. And then there are various ways of doing it, right from pranic healing to Reiki to crystal healing to mystical sadhana in Tantra and Yoga to mantra sadhana and a variety of things. Then we go to the holistic evaluation of the school and we look at what is the personality like. Is it a very masculine, very cheerful, or a feminine and cheerful, a weak or a strong ego or a weak ego? Whatever way we feel, we can describe the personality. Based on our knowledge, we describe it. We look at the phenomenological causation, which we have seen in various schools. We put it together and we consolidate a final position. Then we take a look at the defenses which are being used. Very important. What defenses is the person using? We take a look at the ego strength, the capacity to bear affect, and the socio-economic reality of the person. What kind of healing package can the person practically use? Then we go into the generic process of slowly becoming more and more elemental. So we now go into the deconstruction of the process. Let us say we take up the Freudian process of repressed sexuality, or let's say we take up the Kleinian process of the open split. And how do you look at it? So we go back to that situation where this phenomena would have occurred. Or we take up an example which is better, then you don't have to speculate. Take up an example of the split being open in the person. And take a look at which part is playing a major role in that exaggerated thinking? Do you see a problem really in sensation, perception, conception, knowledge, or its inability to turn into wisdom? This will be by and large not the case here. You can remove this part, or you can keep it if you want. So, from the description of the person's involvement in a process, we can make out how the epistemological process is working in general. From the way the person describes the delusion. And in all probability, this would have happened in early childhood also. Then we get into epistemological elementals which are at work in this process. Because in this process, essentially elementals will get processed. And these elementals are here, which are the elemental variables in that process. Certain elements you can remove, like this is not useful to us. This is not useful to us. Look at whatever is useful in the way the delusion is being described. Whatever is useful, keep it. Whatever is not useful, remove it. And then see whatever is applicable. See the level of significance. Is it low, average, or high? And this will give us what epistemological elemental is taking abnormal values in the epistemological process that we use, that we find out, which is describing the delusion. So let us say the delusion is involving omnipotent force on the part of the persecutor. This then, the force element then becomes important. If the delusion involves not specific but platonic forms, then that becomes important. There is a movement from specificity to platonicity. If it involves attribution of too much of quantity of something, then this quantity attribution becomes an important element. So certain elements will by and large be true for most delusions. The element of force, the element of quality, element of quantity, the element of time. This will be by and large useful in most delusions. Then we look at the affect system, that in the delusion being described or hallucination, whatever the case be, how does desire activation take place? How is affect generated? Because whatever is interpreted as very exciting or very terrifying, huge amount of affect will be generated in response to that interpretation. And then how the affect is moving. Once generated, what are the pathways of distribution of that affect? Part will be expressed, part will be sublimated, part will be regulated, part will overflow into symptoms or psychosomatic problems. And mark the level high, low, very high, high, average, low, very low. That will give us an idea about the affect system at the elemental level, what variables are distorting the affect system. So if you are looking at, let us say, a case of cognitive thought disturbance, and if the presence of somebody very successful or good looking causes a micro episode, then we know that the stimulus strength is a very important factor in that disturbance, in causing that disturbance. If something is happening every day at a particular time, we know there is some biological clock at work. Or the person is keeping his own artificial psychological clock, maybe that is at work. Or when the deprivation happens in the environment, something triggers. And then we can go into the other part of it. And other part of it, the second part of it, the evaluation system, that requires discussion with the person. Sensitivity requires both our assessment and information from the person and people around him. Affinity is something that we measure. Free energy is our judgment. Life energy is our judgment. Affect expressed comes from, desire strength comes from both. From our assessment, this data given by the patient, also from people around him. All the three sources give information. This also needs a lot of discussion and information from patient, our assessment, and people around the patient. The last one, of course, is easiest to know. It is why the patient has come to you. Then we get into the deepest part of the analysis, the elementals. Just to recollect, there is a separate lecture on elementals in heat, and in that all elementals are divided into 8 categories, and they are further listed out one by one. So first we'll list out fundamental elementals, motivational elementals, process elementals, and so on. I'll not go into details of it. You can see that discussion on YouTube. So in what we are talking about, let us say if you're looking at a split, a case where split is open, maybe this, or with cognitive thought disorder, the Bionian part is on, this may not be the problem, this may not be the problem, this may not be the problem. This may not be the problem. So we'll be left with these 5 elements from that comprehensive list if we take up a cognitive thought disorder or some psychotic problem of that type in the chapter, or even schizophrenia. Let's say if we talk about schizophrenia, which comes from attack on linking, we will be left with these 5 elements. Others can be removed. From this list, we can remove aesthetics. In some cases, we can remove this one. If we are looking at a Bionian phenomena-led schizophrenia, we are looking at these elementals, how they are operating. From this list, we can remove this. We have already done there, but let it be there. They are both involved. We cannot remove them. Either this or the opposite of it. Whatever is there, we have to get into it. The important element here is, as Beyond says, that the core problem is of resistance of true knowledge and resistance of love and predominance of hate and avoidance of knowledge. The question then is, if this variable is important and acutely out of the normal range, then you can address it with multiple tools. One of the good parts of this whole system is that because you are doing so much of thinking, you are taking 3 times the time that you would normally take for a case history. So instead of 1.5 hours for a case history, you will be taking 1.5 hours, 3 sessions. But this investment of extra 3 hours will save 30 hours of therapy, because you already know, at least in the provisional sense, in a more comprehensive way where the problem is, and you can address that elemental using various tools. So one of the important elements of heat is to develop tools or to borrow tools if they already pre-exist, and use these tools for investigation, for therapy, and for healing. I mean, investigation and healing. Look at the resultant pathological elementals which are at work. What is most intense, most out of range, and most strong element? Often on the surface, often it may not be on the surface. And those, whatever the elements be, they have to be addressed. So one of the things this approach does is gives you a very comprehensive list of all that has to be addressed. And then you have to find out tools or wait for an opportunity in therapy to address it. These are the net leftover results of long-term suffering. That at the end of it all, after years of suffering, what are the steady enduring things the person is living with in terms of everyday living? It can be distorted schemas which have come to exist. It can be distorted affective patterns. It can be wrong habits. It can be wrong reflexes. It can be a tragic holding state, one of the worst things, where one finds a state holding, although it is a state of suffering. One feels safe and reconciles to the suffering of a state, because it also provides some sort of tried and tested safety. These three we can remove in our analysis. Coming to healing, contrary to classical approach, which is either medication or psychotherapy or combined medication and psychotherapy, we cast the landscape wider. We include self-work. Some forms of therapy like CBT also have self-work. So we place great importance of self-work. Not that everyone can do it, but we try our best. Self-healing skills if necessary. If we are looking at acute schizophrenia, it's out of question. But if we are looking at mild psychosis, a person can learn some pranic healing, some reiki, some crystal healing, some yoga, and do good to himself and be an active participant in one's self-healing. More active participant. Spiritual and mystical practices, if he is interested, of course, it's a question of interest and belief. But if belief and interest permits, they also are included. Hobbies, very important. Some hobbies which the person innately likes, it's very important to engage with them. And some social work if the person feels like this. All of this goes into a holistic healing plan. Taking up one part of the holistic healing plan, which is psychotherapy, and detailing it out. The first part of therapy approach in need is safety and expression. The person has to feel safe to express, has to feel a sense of positivity, has to be able to live out his sensitivity, give out his story. And then we move to articulation of desire. First, let him exhaust his story fully from all the angles, and then let us go to articulation of desire. Then affect expression, and then internalize the peace and silence in the session without feeling disturbed at all. After safety, trust, and self-expression, we go to problem analysis. Start with persons, how he analyzes the problem, how he looks at the cost-benefit analysis, how he thinks of a positive goal, and an action plan, and then come to your own. Then we go to deeper therapy work, and we do it in the context, remembering that we are looking at a holistic healing framework, and the person also would be going to other healers or healing himself if he knows other systems of healing. And then we do the classical work, which includes all the elements of classical psychotherapy work: free association analysis, dream analysis, holding, facilitating the internalization of a good object, leaving out the self-object experiences if necessary, helping bridge the split, helping overcome the Oedipus, helping make the catastrophic thinking conscious and overcome it. All those classical elements are there. And then we go to template work and deeper elemental work. Template work, of course, by and large we do, but elemental work is different. Which elements have to be worked upon? Because the therapy approach is also informed by the elemental analysis we have done. So we don't have to wait for 100 sessions for something to come up. And quite an amount of do it yourself, which is certain things we can give for the person, or the person can find out and not find out, let's say you give it to the person. Starts with very small element of homework and goes on to more complicated areas. After a long period of not a long period, but a moderate period of deeper psychotherapy work, we come to high volume affect release. You can use tools of ISTDP, ECT, affect specific workshops like a workshop on anger or workshop on pain or a workshop on envy. We can ask the person to attend the workshops and, if possible, get into high volume affect release. ISTDP, ECT, EDT techniques, if we know, we can do it ourselves, or we can ask the person to go to somebody and get it done. This is a tantric practice of Avishta. If you have a tantra master around, it can be done, not without him. Psychodrama, if you have an expert around, it can be done. These elements, they follow after a long, not long, but a moderately deep therapy. Directly going here does not help as much. And this is a short-term work. We have to finish and get back to the therapy and consolidate the healing. Consolidation involves consolidation of positive states, consolidation in action, a happy revisit to the past, account of alternative life, which would have been had the pathology not been there, and now a complete story of life as it is going to be. It involves acceptance, reality acceptance, mourning, creating a positive state, and finally again goal fixing. It may lead to the same goal as before or a different goal, but now after a long journey, the person is into goal giving, goal creation and goal giving to oneself in a far more enlightened way. So goals that used to be, goals that were achieved, goals that could not be achieved, a mourning of it, and now a good goal for oneself. And the story of how the good goal is going to shape life, and if realized, how it will be in terms of pleasure, satisfaction, and fulfillment. And then it comes to living. Large part of Western psychotherapy is based on reflecting, not acting. In the East, living it out is a far more voluminous part of the therapy. Sorry, not therapy, but self-healing. Healing rather, not self-healing, but healing. And this is a part of heat that living is, proportionately speaking, given more importance than the classical approach. So one goes by living beyond reflecting. One gets into living and where necessary gets guidance and consolidates a new normal, and then moves on to his free, spontaneous living and does not need therapy anymore. Termination happens. Thank you. It's difficult without a specific case to go into specifics of application of the model. Difficulty is you can't go public with a case. There are confidentiality issues. So this is the generic way in which it can be applied. If there is a published case in a journal or some book, and if the author permits with the permission of patient and everyone else concerned, then with hiding of all the identifying information or taking just the generic part of the case, we can discuss someday how to apply this in a more specific way. the heat model to schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. Today we'll have to stop with a generic elaboration of application, specifics in time to come. Thank you.